So what I'm going to talk to you about today is economic research on intergenerational mobility. And so this is very close to me. When I was in your shoes around 1999, 2000 in graduate school, uh, I ended up getting sucked into doing research on intergenerational mobility. I did my dissertation on the topic, and I've continued to work in the area. And I think it's a really interesting topic. Now it's really entered the mainstream of both academic research and for policy circles where this is often very talked about. So it's very exciting for me to be able to talk to you about this. So let me give you an outline of what I hope to do today. We'll see how it goes with time and everything. First, I'll give you some motivation, and I'll also should mention that since most of my research is US-based and some of the other papers I'm going to be talking about is US-based, even the motivation will be a little bit US-based, but I think there'll be themes that will be relevant to other countries as well. Then I'll briefly talk about theory related to intergenerational mobility, just to give you an idea of some of the background of what's been done. As you'll see as I get into the talk, I think theory hasn't played as much a role compared to empirical work in this area up to now, but I think recently this is changing, and I think potentially going forward, theory will have a lot more to say about the research that's been done on the empirical side. Then I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about different measures of mobility. And I think one theme that I want to convey is that some of the major papers that you've probably heard about or have read, or some of the ones I'm going to talk about, have been focused on a couple of main measures, but I feel like the literature is much richer than that, and I think one of the areas in which intergenerational mobility is growing as a field is because of newer and more interesting measures. Okay, and also I want to say, please feel free to stop me, because otherwise I may put you to sleep. So, and myself. Okay. So then I think after I talk about some mobility measures, I'm going to do a very selected literature review. And this will go back a little bit in time, even to before I started writing my dissertation, because I think it's important to sort of see where this literature came from. And what I'm going to emphasize is that a lot of what economics has contributed to this literature has really been around measurement and better measuring some of the measures of intergenerational mobility. I'm going to talk through 4 studies in some detail, not hopefully excruciating detail, but some general detail at least, to kind of show you how the literature has evolved and where we're at right now. And then I'll have a few slides where I'll talk about cross-country differences to give you a flavor of what's some of the international work that's been done, since admittedly I'm not going to be covering that in great depth. Okay, and then we'll see how time goes. I prepared a section on causal estimates of intergenerational mobility, which I think is going to be one of the emerging fields that will be of interest and has already started to get more attention. And I think this is where there's some interesting issues around research design and trying to get at good identification and moving beyond what largely has been a descriptive literature in economics. Okay, and then finally I'll just wrap up and talk about some general themes of where I think the literature may be heading. And so this might be useful for those of you who are thinking about doing research in this field to see potentially what kinds of research topics are out there. Okay, and again, my email address with any questions you have. Okay, so I would say that overwhelmingly, most of the economic research on intergenerational mobility has been motivated by this idea of equality of opportunity. Okay, and really when you get into it, I think it's largely motivated by an idea of promoting upward mobility from the bottom. That this is really about, largely about poverty and whether or not those who start in poverty face a set of distinct barriers that prevent them from moving up in the income distribution in the next generation. So if your parents were poor, what are your life's chances of being able to move out of poverty? Do you have the opportunity? Do you have the schools? Does your family have the resources? Does your neighborhood have the social capital and institutions that allow you to advance? And I think that's largely what the research has been thinking about. So I put this quote from a very old book now by Michael Harrington, written in 1962, that I think sums up the idea. So he writes, "The real explanation of why the poor are where they are is that they made the mistake of being born to the wrong parents in the wrong section of the country, in the wrong industry, or in the wrong racial or ethnic group. Once that mistake has been made, they could have been paragons of will and morality, but most of them would never even had a chance to get out of the other America." So the idea is, is this the case? Are there people that for whom the barriers are preventing them from exercising the opportunity to escape inequality, to escape poverty? In the US, I think there's an important cultural side to this that informs a lot of why the US had been very interested in this topic for many decades. There are many examples of this. I put one. There's this notion that in the United States, we like to think of our country as the opportunity society, where you could start out poor, and if you just work hard enough, you can make it as a successful businessman or entrepreneur or what have you. And this was encapsulated in these 19th century novels by a writer named Horatio Algier, who wrote these stories of young boys who moved from what he called rags to riches. So some of what we're going to be talking about in terms of mobility is really this upward mobility from the bottom. What are your opportunity for moving from rags to riches, from the bottom to the top? And it's interesting, these were all fictional books, and Alger himself was actually a second generation Harvard guy, so this is, he was in a privileged elite institution himself. So it's unclear to what extent, we were ever in the United States truly a society characterized by these kinds of novels. Okay, I think a second way of thinking about why studying intergenerational mobility is important is kind of a more general idea about characterizing the nature of inequality in the society. And this is a little bit loose, whether or not we think it's fair. So I'll come back to thinking about social welfare maybe a few times in the talk. But I just want to be clear, none of these motivations are going to directly map to welfare, but maybe they should. So I put up a quote here from Gary Solon, whose paper I'm going to talk about in more detail. But he wrote in a handbook chapter in the Handbook of Labor Economics, a nice example to kind of motivate this idea. So imagine you have two societies, Society A and Society B. They both have the same level of cross-sectional inequality. But in Society A, one's position in the income distribution is exactly inherited from where your parents were. If you were the third richest family, if your parents were the third richest family, on average, you and your siblings will be the third richest, and so on, exactly in that ordering. Now you can imagine another Society B where you have the same level of inequality, but essentially people are somewhat scattered in where they end up. There's perfect mobility. There's no dependence on where you started in terms of where you end up. And the idea is that they may have the same level of inequality, but we would clearly think about them very differently. And again, without putting a welfare position on it, the idea is just like economists study measures of inequality, a Gini coefficient, variance in log income, intergenerational mobility is an important and interesting descriptive characterization of the nature of inequality in society. And so I think it's just an inherently interesting thing to kind of know where our society, where different countries fall on this spectrum of perfect mobility to perfect rigidity. Okay, and again, interrupt me. Yeah, yes.
So let me interrupt you back and ask a question. If we think about Gary's thought experiment, from the point of view of an individual having to choose which society to be born in, you might think that a risk-averse individual would of at least a large hunk of these people, because of things like either risk aversion or loss aversion, right, would prefer to be born into the less mobile society.
Yeah.
Not everyone, of course. So is it so obvious from a welfare theoretic perspective?
No, I don't think it is, and I think I think there's a real tension because a lot of the policy debate in the U.S. I think is characterized by this idea that we want greater mobility, which sounds like a good thing, but that as a parent, we like the idea of passing on the advantages we've gotten, and I think analogous to the example you're giving, that may be to some degree welfare enhancing, and where exactly people lie in their preferences for this, and I highlighted two extreme cases. So I think that's an open question, and I'll come back to this idea that I think it's very challenging to try to get this body of research to map into clear welfare answers. But I think there is some research that I've contributed to a little bit that potentially can do that, and that's something that all of you can think about as well. So yes, thank you. Okay, and then I put up this quote kind of half for fun from Jim Heckman and Flavio Cunha, who talk about this idea that's really also captured in the Harrington quote, that we think about when we're writing down models of human capital investment, that there are budget constraints of parents have only so many resources. Can they borrow from their future income? Can they borrow from their children's future income? But there's this idea that there's a fundamental constraint where a child can't choose its parent. It can't choose the amount of resources that it's born into. And so the accident of birth itself raises this question of why intergenerational mobility is important, because it's essentially talks about an implicit constraint. Okay, fourth reason I would give, and this is something that motivated me to study this topic, is about the persistence of inequality. So when I was in graduate school at Berkeley in the 90s, one of the big issues was around this idea of affirmative action or racial preferences. So in America, you have this fundamental issue where African Americans were brought into the United States and as slaves and lived in a segregated society until only so many generations ago that we fully eliminated segregation throughout the country. And the idea that I thought was interesting and important that didn't really seem to get talked about in the debates around affirmative action or preferences is how long is enough for a large racial gap to be eliminated? Does it just take a generation? We had the Civil Rights Act in the United States in the mid-1960s. By 2000, when I was in grad school, 35 years, a little more than a generation. Is that enough? Maybe, maybe not. And I thought of this as kind of an empirical question to understand the rate at which gaps in society dissipate, or the flip side of that of how much persistence there is in inequality. So I put up this quote from US Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in a decision related to affirmative action, where she wrote, "We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today." And so the idea is, where did the 25 years come from? Was this something where we have this body of social science research that says when it comes to, this was a law school admissions case, that we know applicants who are from disadvantaged backgrounds in another generation will be equally capable as the majority. And I actually don't think this was informed by great research. I think it was just this idea that, oh, probably in a generation would be enough. But do we really know that? Okay. And then there's, I think, interesting policy implications. And I think this is sort of a fraught area, because I will at the same time caution you that what we take from the intergenerational mobility research to policy doesn't always line up very nicely. The example I gave of downward mobility, of wanting to keep your advantage if you're successful and pass that advantage on to your kids, and not wanting to see downward mobility, is one of those examples when we say we want more mobility. But what I'm thinking of here is that suppose some of this persistence in intergenerational transmission of income is actually causal. Something about having more money, whether it buys you better health for your child when they're young, better school readiness, better schools themselves, better neighborhoods, better peers, if some of that is causal, then to the extent that we start thinking about policies like early childhood education, or school desegregation initiatives, or things that have to do with human capital policy, then potentially some of these can spill over to the next generation. So it's useful to know that. And I think in the US, I would say one of the things that I think is really interesting is at the very same time that we're having these policy debates about social welfare, about welfare programs and safety net programs, like Medicaid and food stamps, programs like that ensure the most vulnerable, there's a whole body of research coming out that's looking at the long-run effects of these programs that were rolled out in the 1960s that never made it into those debates about the cost-benefit of having food stamps or health insurance for kids, but do have the spillover. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about theory quickly. So the seminal first model in this literature, as in many literatures, was work by Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes. And they laid out a two-period model where parents choose between their own consumption and investing in their children's human capital, and have utility in both generations' consumption. And kind of the key idea that they pointed out, one key idea is that you can imagine there's this whole array of endowments that are passed on from parents to kids. And in Becker's world, this would include things like your race, the industry your dad worked in, things like that. And those kinds of things would lead to some degree of intergenerational persistence. But the idea was that if you had perfect capital markets where parents could borrow against their expected kids' future income, they would know that if they invested in their kids' schooling, their kids would maybe grow up to be lawyers and doctors, and they could both be better off. And this would, to some degree, maybe sever the intergenerational link. But in the presence of a borrowing constraint, it's hard to think about markets where you can borrow against your children's future success. You may have this result where parents suboptimally invest in their kids' human capital. And so some of the persistence would come from this endowment that's passed on, but some of the persistence would come from this suboptimal behavior. Now, in practice, really this hasn't driven a lot of the empirical literature. In my dissertation, I tried to test this, and some papers have. But in practice, it's difficult too, because there are alternate explanations for why you could see differences in mobility by, it's hard to really identify people who are borrowing constrained, et cetera. There's household heterogeneity. So this has kind of not been a real focal point of the empirical research. Since that time, I'm going to talk about a few models that I think have been somewhat influential. I'm to be fair, again, this is a selected literature review, so I'm skipping many theory papers and some important ones. But so Gary Solon wrote an extension of the Becker-Tomes model to try to understand the role of government in this, and essentially to try to interpret the emerging literature at that time that was looking at estimates of intergenerational mobility across countries and trying to look at changes over time to see whether mobility was rising or falling. And essentially added government taxes and public investments in human capital into the model. And there may be 4 or 5 implications. I think the 2 that were most salient from this model was that persistence also decreases with public investment in human capital. So to the degree that parents maybe suboptimally invest in kids' human capital, that could potentially be made up for by government financing and public provision, whether that be universities or preschool, et cetera. Also, an important part of the literature was in the US and many other advanced economies, starting around 1980, you had this pronounced increase in the returns to schooling, where in the labor market, those with higher education and higher skills were making much more money. And what were the implications of that for intergenerational persistence? And it kind of follows straightforwardly that if the returns to schooling are rising, that's going to lead to greater intergenerational persistence as the gaps, even holding constant a gap in educational attainment would lead to rising differentials, and that would pass over into the next generation. Okay. One paper that I'll briefly mention that I think is maybe one of the in my view one of the more important papers. It's not yet published. I think it's at a second round at the Journal of Political Economy, so hopefully will be published soon by Nybaum and Stuhler. And basically, they go into the model in even greater depth and point out show kind of a simple point that what we view as intergenerational mobility today could be the result of shocks, policy shocks, or shocks to the economic environment from many generations ago that's continuing to play out. And that these shocks do not necessarily have a monotonic path. One simple example that doesn't really have any great theoretical content, but you could think about a situation where, say, you're looking at the correlation in educational attainment across generations, and then you have a major policy intervention. Like in the US, they had something called a GI Bill, where they let returning veterans from World War II go to college for much cheaper. You may have a compression of the education distribution in one generation, and purely mechanically that would feed over into a larger persistence estimate in the next generation. So something that reduced or compressed inequality in education could mechanically lead your regression coefficient to be higher in the next period. So it's examples like that, but many more that show that these when we're looking at trends in intergenerational mobility, we shouldn't necessarily think that they're capturing contemporary factors. And this could be very relevant for China, where you've got a massive change in institutions and in the economic environment that's been going on over the last few decades, and these may potentially play out for generations to come. Okay. 2 new models that I think potentially might be influential. One is by Lee and Seshadri, and Seshadri is on both of these. And I think this first one is very relevant to HCEO, because the idea is that they're motivated by the work of Jim Heckman and many others who've worked on early life influences and human capital development early in life, to show that the potential for constraints on financing investments early in life could play out much more than later. And so they modify the Becker-Tomes model to include several periods: early childhood, later childhood, and then run through the model and show how budget constraints at particular points in the life course can be particularly important. So I think this is a very exciting and emerging area of research. There's been some empirical work done, mainly, and this is a recurring theme, in Nordic countries, because they've been collecting information on everyone's income back to, the 1950s in some cases, in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, so they can observe intergenerational mobility for an entire population, and they can look at income earned over the entire lifespan and isolate the effects of early income. But I think now that having models may have other predictions that could guide empirical research as well. The second paper by Durloff and Seshadri, I think, is motivated by the so-called Great Gatsby curve that I'll talk about in a little while, which basically shows that across countries, intergenerational mobility is declining with cross-sectional inequality. And the recent work that I'll talk about in more detail by Raj Chetty and co-authors, showing how there's a lot of variation in intergenerational mobility across space in the United States at very localized city level. And they build a model to show how neighborhoods and income segregation in neighborhoods can arise endogenously and in turn affect intergenerational mobility. So it provides a theoretical basis for how inequality could then be linked to intergenerational mobility. So I think this is, in my mind, not yet really hit the literature hard, but I think these kind of theory papers could really expand the role of theory in the intergenerational mobility literature. Maybe I'll stop for a moment if there are any questions. Okay, all right, so I'll charge on then. Okay, so I think I've said most of this. The early work emphasized borrowing constraints, but I don't really think that took off. There was an influential paper by Arthur Goldberger who argued that a mechanical model was probably equally informative in terms of an empirical content. But I think the newer models have highlighted important roles for how public policy and changes in inequality could affect intergenerational mobility, and how life cycle models and spatial inequality could affect intergenerational mobility. So I'm sensed that there may be a change in this literature. To some degree, theory has followed empirical work, but I think in going forward, we may just have a lot of empirical results and have a difficult time to make sense of them. And I think these models will play an important role going forward. Okay. So I'm going to spend a chunk of time now talking about different measures of intergenerational mobility. And I decided to show you more measures rather than fewer, and the trade-off is that I won't go in as great depth, but if you have questions, again, please feel free to ask. So the first measure I'm going to show you, and the most commonly used in the literature, is the so-called intergenerational elasticity. And it's about as simple a regression as you could run. You basically have, as your dependent variable, log y1, where y is typically measured as some measure of income. It could be earnings, wages, family income. And 1 denotes for the kid's generation, and y0 is the parent's generation. And when these are both measured in logs, this beta coefficient is an elasticity. Okay, and it basically answers a question if you compare two families and the income in one family was, say, 10% higher, then what would the income of the descendants of that family be in roughly percentage terms? Since it's log-log, it's not exact. So if this beta coefficient were, say, 0.5, it would suggest that about 50% of the differences in income between two families are passed on into the next generation, and maybe 50% dissipate. Okay? Why do we use this measure? I don't think it's often really spelled out, but I think the idea is that it conveys this idea of origin independence. So for those of you who are really interested in these measures, I would recommend you read Fields and Oak. I can send you the exact site if you're interested, where they go through a set of mobility measures and axioms about it, but it's a bit dense, so I wanted to abstract from that here. And the idea is, I think origin independence is probably most associated with equality of opportunity because it conveys this idea that where you started doesn't necessarily deterministically lead to where you end up. But I should say, and I'll come back to this, this is an imperfect measure of equality of opportunity. Okay, and there's a literature that I may talk about very briefly that more directly tries to measure opportunity. Because here, what we're doing is we're measuring outcomes. And the idea is if there's this high persistence in outcomes, we suspect that it's due to lack of mobility, but it's not a direct measure of mobility. Another point I should make is that it's important to remember that this captures relative mobility rather than absolute mobility. So it could be the case that persistence is very high, but if you're in a rapidly growing economy, like where we are now, everyone may be better off, even if you occupy the same position in the income distribution that your parents did. So it's important to know most of the economics literature on intergenerational mobility has focused on relative mobility, and until recently I've been the same way. And my thinking had been that basically absolute mobility is really largely a question about macro, or that so I thought that why countries grow and how rapidly they grow is a question that macro people think about. But things about inequality of opportunity were things that I was interested in. So why relative mobility, why you can't move up or down the relative income ladder was a question I was interested in. But I think a lot of recent work has shown that absolute mobility is a function of both growth and the distributional consequences of growth. And so there's, for example, recent work by Raj Chetty and co-authors published in Science that argues that absolute mobility in the US has declined a fair amount, and argues that much more of that has been due to a widening of the income distribution rather than due to a decline in the rate of economic growth. So again, I think that's another area for future research. Okay, a brief aside, one other great thing about the intergenerational mobility literature is it's highly related to the birth of modern statistics. So the 19th century British Victorian scientist Sir Francis Galton was interested in questions of the rate of regression to the mean in height, among other characteristics that he looked at. So he plotted here, for example, the average of parents' height and the average of kids' height, and drew these dots and tried to fit a line through them. And this notion of regression to the mean gave birth to what we call in the statistical technique of regression, and similarly with correlations. Okay, second measure I'm going to talk about is the yes?
I think it's like in your professor, want to go back to like 2 slides.
Yeah.
When you say Y1 and Y0 here, this is a life cycle income, right? It's the income over.
Yeah, I kind of I sidestepped that. That's a good question.
But we don't observe that. So what's the
Yeah. So right. In principle, the literature, and this is a choice as well, the literature has said what we're interested in is some measure of permanent income, okay? And that we want to capture the persistence or mobility with respect to permanent income. And in reality, we're not going to have data on that. And so does that have a consequence? Say if you happen to find some survey in China where they measured income of parents and income of kids, but the income was only reflecting a few years in the life cycle, how important is that for estimating this beta? So I'm going to basically put that off because the 4 papers I'm going to talk about are largely about exactly that question. So, but that's a good point. And there's also some debate because when we move from this literature to, say, models like Lee and Seshadri that say it's important to look at the income of parents when the kid is very young, to look for budget constraints, suggests that, we might want a model where maybe this pops out of the model, but really this coefficient varies across the life cycle and might be very important when the kid is very young. Okay. So the intergenerational correlation is simply the correlation in these outcomes rather than the regression coefficient. And rather than telling you answering the question about gaps and percentage differences across families, this correlation coefficient essentially tells you something about positional mobility. Okay, so it tells you, what if your position in the distribution is higher than another family's, what's the likelihood that you'll share that position in the income distribution. And I'll show you the relationship in just a second between the intergenerational correlation and the elasticity. But first I'll show you a third measure that's recently gotten a lot of attention because it's been used in the couple of the Chetty et al. Papers, which is looking at rank mobility. And this is slightly different. It's essentially the correlation coefficient between the ranks rather than the income level. Okay? And essentially it's the regression coefficient from a simple OLS of taking the parent rank on the child rank. And once again, the concept is positional mobility rather than thinking of a gap. So the idea could be, in principle, in practice, most of these measures are fairly similar. You don't typically see very large differences, but in principle, you could have an intergeneration correlation that's fairly low, but have an elasticity that's much higher, simply because of the nature of inequality in the 2 generations. Okay, so how are they related? So this slide basically shows you that. It shows you that the regression coefficient can be thought of as the intergenerational correlation coefficient times the ratio of the standard deviation of the child's income over the parent's income. Now, I want to be careful here because often people take this to say, and not to pick on them too much, but in sociology, I've often had people tell me, well, we prefer the intergenerational correlation because it's invariant to changes in inequality. But that's a bit more of a loaded statement because even though it appears, so the argument is, suppose that sigma is growing from the parent generation to the kid generation, it could be the case that maybe the correlation has stayed constant, but because the variance is growing or the sigma is growing, beta is higher. And is that really a decline in mobility or an increase in persistence? Or is it just an increase in inequality? But the idea is that these are not, this is not a structural equation where we can necessarily think of holding fixed rho and simply changing inequality. You might think that part of what drives inequality is the beta. Okay, if parents are able to transmit more advantages and beta is growing over time, that might change the sigmas, and so all of these are endogenously perhaps related to one another, and so it's not so clear that you could simply characterize it that way. But nevertheless, it is a nice kind of convenient thing to highlight the difference in the measures, and it's often a way of, so the first point I want to say is there's no one right measure to use. They're answering somewhat different questions, and they're getting at different conceptual ideas. Again, if you're interested in thinking about how long will it take, say, the black-white gap in income to disappear, or a similar, say, regional gap in China or another country to disappear, you might be more interested in the beta. But if you're want to know how positional mobility exists, then you'd be interested in the correlation. And then you might want to think about whether you want a measure that's inclusive or exclusive of inequality. So to give you one example, one of the Chetty papers that looked at changes over time in intergenerational mobility used the rank-rank slope and showed that the rank-rank slope is fairly constant. And they basically used the language of, so while mobility has stayed the same, the consequences of that mobility, constant mobility, has changed because inequality has risen. But that's sort of saying that your preferred measure of mobility is one that's invariant to inequality. It could be perfectly equal or compelling to say intergenerational mobility has declined because inequality has risen. And so, it's a matter of semantics there, but it's important, to be careful about, and I'll come back to this theme when you're studying this, which is the concept you're interested in, which is the measure you're using, are they mapping to the same concept, do different concepts give you different answers? So I'm going to sort of suggest that you guys continue to, in general, I think empirical microliterature, more is better, not always, but often it's good to kind of say, well, what does a different measure give you? And if it's different, why? If it's the same, is that and distinguishing something that's a robustness check between something that's giving you a different conceptual answer. Okay, now I'll try to be a little bit quicker. Another area, typically many papers have used these so-called transition probabilities. And so these are related to rank as well. Essentially, we assign each person in each generation a percentile in the income distribution. And then you can basically see what are the probabilities that if you started in some origin set of income quantiles, what's the probability that you move to a different set of quantiles? Often in practice, this is done by using quintiles of the income distribution. So often we think of rags to riches that I talked about as what's the probability that if your parents were in the bottom quintile, that you move to, say, the top quintile. And so here, what we're now showing, the y's are representing percentiles, and this is saying conditional on y0 being below the 20th percentile, at or below the 20th percentile, what's the probability that the kid's income is greater than the 80th percentile? And so this would be one of many possible transition probabilities you could estimate. It's often common to show a full transition matrix. One argument I'm going to make is that it's often easier to use the rank-based measures or transition probabilities to study group differences in mobility, especially when you're looking with respect to a common population. Okay, so to give you an example, this is some made-up data to capture this idea that if you were looking at racial differences in the US in intergenerational mobility, and you were thinking of just focusing on the elasticity alone, if you plotted the red squares here are showing you sort of fake data for blacks where the mean log income of parents is lower than the mean log income of parents of whites, who are the blue circles, and the mean log income in the kid generation is similarly lower for blacks. The slope here is flatter. This would tell you that this IGE is smaller and that there's greater mobility for blacks than whites. But there's greater mobility with respect to the black income distribution. So just looking at that parameter alone could give you a misleading idea of intergenerational mobility. I mean, if you took into account the constant and the slope and wrote a very careful sentence, you could use the traditional apparatus. But the idea is that when you hold constant the income distribution and then look at transition probabilities where you're looking at blacks and whites with respect to the same distribution, then you have a very nice apples to apples comparison. So this is an example of this. It's probably hard to read, but I'll give you, highlight a couple of examples. On the left are whites, and on the right are blacks. And basically, this is saying that if you started in the bottom quintile in this row in the parent generation, these are the probabilities that you would stay in the bottom quintile in the kids' generation. 26% would stay, and about 74% would move into one of these higher quintiles. For blacks, 51% would stay in the bottom quintile, and only 50% would move higher up in the distribution. And one interesting thing I might return to is even among blacks who started in the top quintile, a very high percentage, over 50%, would move below the bottom quintile, below the third quintile, below the 60th percentile in the distribution in the kids' generation. So there's a dramatic amount of downward mobility among blacks. So going back up to the transition probabilities, this is an important tool for studying both directional differences in mobility, because the elasticity isn't telling you where the movement is happening, it's summarizing it in one parameter, and it's also more helpful for looking at subgroups of the population. It's not a perfect measure. For example, you have this issue of a floor and a ceiling. If you pick quintiles, somebody who's in the bottom quintile can't move down by this measure, and someone in the top quintile can't move further up by this measure. And the choice of which quantiles you use to characterize the probabilities is somewhat arbitrary. So an alternative measure that I've worked on, something I worked on with Devapam Bhattacharya at Cambridge, is this idea of a directional rank mobility. It also uses percentiles and ranks, but rather than using an arbitrary quantile, it uses your own parent's quantile to define mobility. So let me just finish this example. So in this example, you have maybe this, you have a conditioning. This measure only really makes sense when you break up the distribution. So if you say, for example, among parents below a particular quantile, say the bottom 20%, what's the probability that you exceed your parents' rank in the distribution? And then you can add an increment. Say, what's the probability that you exceed your parents by 20 percentage points or what have you? So when this tau parameter is 0, this answers a very simple question. Are you higher in the income distribution than your parents were? And to some extent, that's nice kind of transparent statistic to talk about. Yes? I've done something that may be getting at what you're asking. So I have a paper looking at black-white mobility differences. We're asked the questions. Assume, for the sake of argument, that what the estimates I showed, which characterize mobility for a set of cohorts, persisted over time. What would that imply for the steady state distributions? And that would show, it was interesting because it showed essentially a permanent gap between blacks and whites. And we know historically, even though the gap is still large, it's been narrowing over time. So you can use these transition probabilities to say something about persistence, like you say, but I think embedded in that is sort of an assumption about whether this is a constant set of parameters or something that can
I'm a little troubled by the fact, for example, suppose that you thought that the white income distribution stochastically dominated the black income distribution, and then you did the kind of chunking that the transition probability requires, which is the low end of the groups are dominated by blacks and the high end of the groups are dominated by whites. So you would, it makes the process look Markov that's really not at that level.
Yeah, no, you're right. And we talk in the paper with Bhattacharya, we talk about that issue. So there's sort of, I'm probably not going to be able to state it well, but there's a sort of a similar problem with there's a problem with both the transition probabilities when one distribution stochastically dominates the other, and with this direction. Neither is immune to the issue. So I take your point. It's not a purely perfect measure by that token. Again, it kind of feeds the idea that I'm writing a paper right now for the Journal of Economic Literature, where that partially motivated what I'm showing you today on the multiple measures, where we're using Australian tax data and we're running through a variety of these measures, and the idea is to sort of say that some of these give you different answers, and it depends on the questions you're asking, et cetera. Okay. So this is just an example to show you some empirical estimates. So this is a paper that I wrote with Miles Korek and Matthew Lindquist using Canadian, Swedish, and US data to show you what's the upward directional rank mobility, where here we set tau to equal 0.2. So what's the probability that you exceeded your parents' rank in the distribution by 20 percentiles? And then here we vary where you start in the income distribution. So these are cumulatively growing samples. So for example, this point is the bottom quintile, and in the US, something over 50% will exceed their parents by 20 percentiles, but that number is quite a bit larger and almost identical in Sweden and Canada. I'll come back and show you more empirical results, but this is just one of many statistics by which the US looks worse on the front of upward mobility. Okay, so I mentioned that in terms of social welfare, the mobility research hasn't really focused on that. And I think there's some work that's being done. So I have a paper with a whole bunch of co-authors using very many different countries, where we build on work by Albergay and Magna Mogstad, who've done a couple of papers looking at what they call mobility curves. In their context, they were looking at intra-generational mobility, where they looked at what's your likelihood of moving up in the income distribution over your lifetime. And they basically set up these kind of non-parametric mobility estimates, where they say, what's your change in rank at every starting point in the income distribution? And essentially, those kinds of functions very nicely can map to the literature on social welfare functions. That's in the inequality social welfare literature. Now, those functions still have weights that you could put on them, where you can say, suppose I value greater upward mobility from the bottom, then one part of that curve I might place greater weight than another part. But that adds a judgment to this literature. So I think it's also problematic in that I don't know that everyone's going to perfectly agree on what the right social welfare function should be, but at least it gives us a potential tool for doing that. A couple other points I would make is if you look at rank changes between parents and kids and run a mobility curve, that's isometric to the Chetty et al. Rank association. So out of that, you could potentially link their work to social welfare. And you could also look at absolute mobility as well. So I put up an example of a curve that we ran for Norway, where in this case, we weren't looking at rank changes, but we were looking at how does the share of income change for each percentile of the income distribution. So if you're at the bottom percentile of the income distribution in the parent generation, the change in income share among those people is denoted up here, and that income share tends to fall, somewhat linearly throughout the income distribution, but you see there are these important nonlinearities at the tails of the distribution. So this is for Norway. We calculated this for the US, Sweden, and Germany as well. And as I mentioned, you could put a social welfare function on top of this to aggregate this curve and say something about how does social welfare compare in Norway versus the United States. Okay. Any questions about any of these measures? Okay, so far the first 6 things I've talked about you could think of as loosely about the joint income distribution between parents and kids and different aspects of it, ranks, levels, transitions, etc. What I'm going to talk about now are kind of completely different approaches that don't utilize this joint distribution. And they're typically, so the next example are what I'm going to put together as grouped estimators. And these are estimators people use when they typically don't have data linking intergenerationally directly. So I've got an example of work where I was interested in looking at what's the time pattern of intergenerational mobility in the United States. And really in the US, we don't really have very good intergenerationally linked data prior to the survey called the PSID, run by the University of Michigan. And that started tracking families in 1968. So it covers kind of cohorts born in the 50s who made their income, you know, in their prime earning years in the 80s, 90s, et cetera. So what I wanted to do was come up with a way to track mobility for longer. So what we did was we created synthetic families where we used the every 10-year census to find sort of synthetic families that were grouped together based on their birth state and year of birth. And so you could track these families over time and you could measure the average income of, say, parents who were living in Minnesota in 1950 and then go to the 1980 census, take 30-year-old kids who were born in Minnesota and measure their income. And then we can associate these aggregate cells of income. And this kind of general strategy has become very popular, particularly with the literature on surnames. You may have seen reference to work by Greg Clark, an economic historian at UC Davis, who's used surnames to study intergenerational mobility and has basically linked people by their last name and argued that that conveys something important about intergenerational persistence. So there are a couple of papers. I won't talk about them, but if you're interested in this topic, some nice work by Gary Solon and a paper by an excellent sociologist, Florencia Torche and Corvalon, that discuss the mismatch between grouped estimators versus individual estimators for studying mobility. But just to give you an example, this is what we found using the census data. The blue line is an intergenerational elasticity estimate you get by using these synthetic cohorts. And what we show here in the red line is the returns to college as estimated by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz and some of their work. And you see, especially since about 1980, that these line up very nicely, just showing you this kind of correspondence between rising returns to skill in the US and decreasing intergenerational mobility. Again, the persistence is rising, meaning mobility has declined. Okay, and again, this is important because the PSID data can only really give you data points around here for when those cohorts are observed in the labor market in the 1980s. And the recent work by Chetty et al. On long-term trends is really, if you read their work carefully, just covering the period from 2000 to 2012 or so. So they're saying that mobility in the US has been flat around here. And those points all might be correct and consistent with what we showed, but this is showing you that the real action appears to have changed around 1980 when inequality was rising and the returns to schooling was rising. Okay, almost done with measures. Going to show you a couple more. So one thing that I've also done work on that's different from looking at intergenerationally linked data is to look at siblings. And one really nice advantage of siblings is you don't need to track 2 generations. If you can identify siblings in 1 generation in one data set, that you can ask yourself, how similar are these siblings? And what does that say about the importance of family background? And essentially, these measures can be thought of as a variance decomposition exercise, where you take what's common among siblings as the factor that's shared due to shared family and community background. So it's sort of an omnibus measure, and I think in some ways is more advantageous than simply looking at the intergenerational persistence in income, because there you're just measuring income, whereas the sibling correlation is going to pick up all of the other aspects of family disadvantage, like parents' education, the quality of schools in your neighborhood, your peer influences. It's amalgamating a lot of things, but might be a broader measure of so-called social mobility than just looking at income. Okay, so how does this work? So the basic statistical model is you first basically regression adjust income for, typically year and age effects and just get a residual out of that. And then by construction, you separate the residuals into orthogonal components, a family component, a permanent individual component, and a transitory component if you have panel data on income. And then essentially you decompose the variance into these different portions, and then you take the sibling correlation as the ratio of the family component to the family plus the individual component, and you eliminate the transitory variance. So essentially it's an analog to looking at the sibling correlation in permanent income. Okay? And so to operationalize it, there are different ways of doing it I won't go into, but you can ask me if you're interested in this. So I give you just one example from a paper that I wrote where I use a data set in the US called the NLSY 79, which is really nice for this because they track adolescents and then follow them all the way in, even to now when they're in their 50s. Okay, and this shows you the sibling correlation in earnings, in family income, in wages, and in annual hours. And just to highlight one set of results, you see the sibling correlation in wages in this data is over 0.5. So it's saying that about half of the variation between individuals in their wages can be thought of as due to shared family background or community influences, like schools, peers, and parent characteristics. That sibling correlation is actually higher than what you get as a sibling correlation for height or for weight. Okay, and if you run the sibling correlation in the US for test scores, you get something in the order of 0.6. So again, I think a very interesting descriptive statistic that can be done across countries, potentially can be done across cities with large enough data. So again, I'll come back to this when I talk about Raj Chetty's work that's kind of really put the mark of intergenerational mobility on the map more broadly, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, they could be running sibling correlations for cities. This could be done in all sorts of other contexts as well. Yes?
So here, when we are doing the calculation of the sibling correlations, do we have any restriction on the sibling? For example, for the siblings, like with an age gap of 5 years, or
typically there are those kinds of restrictions that are forced on you by the data. So in this particular case, they started with kids who are 14 to 22, in 14 to 21. So there was only a maximum of a 7-age difference. Some other data, people have run this and checked, and typically it doesn't make a lot of difference, but it potentially is an issue, and it might be different in different contexts. It could be in certain developing countries, because of certain institutions, that you could have different estimates due to that. But you should, most of the literature is doing more closely aged siblings. That it's not necessarily what you'd get for the whole population. Okay, and there are other interesting things I'm not going to show you about gender, brothers and sisters, sister, etc. And there's also a whole related literature that looks at further distances in families, so cousins, nephew. You could put together a model where you put together different kind of shared potential genetic influences, shared environmental characteristics for different distances of connection. And there is a nice literature on that as well. Okay, I wanted to come back to this because this potentially could be an important literature going forward. So as I mentioned, if we really care about equality of opportunity, there's this literature that says, why don't we just measure that? Rather than measuring the intergenerational association in outcomes, let's try to get at opportunity directly. And this is influenced a lot by political philosophy literature, and particularly John Romer has done a lot of work on this. And I'm just going to give you the general idea, and that's the idea is that if you could break up all of the amount of inequality that's due to family circumstances and separate that from individual effort and abilities, then you could say the circumstances portion is really inequality of opportunity. And we might want to perfectly well tolerate the inequality in abilities that's due to effort. Okay, so it has a nice appealing logic to it, that if we could really figure out how much of your success is really due to stuff that you did, we wouldn't want a policy to penalize that. We wouldn't want to penalize good parenting behavior, say, that makes for a stronger transmission. The challenge, I think, empirically, is that it's really hard to credibly separate what's circumstance and what's effort. So I've been to some of these conferences with John Romer where, for example, in his view, if you took the test score of 12-year-olds, right, he would call that circumstance, because in his mind, that's reflecting the 12-year-old's test score is a reflection of the family background and the characteristics of schools, etc. I have a 12-year-old. I don't think he would agree that it's eliminating all effort on his part. So I'm not saying that's wrong, but it gets you into a very complicated set of assumptions that you need to make. And so I think it's challenging, and I hope people continue to work on it. And again, in this Australia example, what I hope to do, I don't know that the data really exists, is to implement some of the empirical methods. And particularly, I'd point to work here by Chico Ferreira of the World Bank, who's done good work operationalizing this, where it'd be nice to compare. Does the inequality of opportunity measures you get correlate very much with IGE or intergenerational rank associations or sibling correlations? So there's a lot that we could do work on to look at the relationship between these measures. Okay. So to summarize, I talked about 9 measures. But if all you knew of the literature was some of the work Gary Solon did, or I did, or Raj Chetty has done, you wouldn't really know about this kind of rich literature. And so I'd encourage you to think about that. And this is not even taking into account some of the literature outside of economics. Okay, so some of the key takeaways. I think we want to be clear on what concepts we want to measure. Measurement itself matters, but this is distinct from conceptual concerns. So this will come up a little bit when I talk about the Chetty work, because they're going to use rank measures, and they're going to motivate it largely by measurement concerns. But as I pointed out, it's picking up a different concept of mobility, positional rather than gaps, and that's fine as long as you're aware that that's what's going on. And then also the other points are, we should always be aware of the disconnects with policy. We're talking about relative mobility. Oftentimes the public, the newspaper writers, the policymakers have in mind absolute mobility. And and in the discussion with Larry, we've been talking a little bit about integrating with social welfare and thinking about what is the right mobility measure. And not a lot has been done, but there's some movement towards that. Okay. Any questions about any of the measures? I'm going to move now to start talking about some of the research papers. Okay, so I'm going to, yes. Yes.
Right,
Go ahead.
so how does that, what exactly the sibling correlation is getting at? Because it's taking out the family background and like the peer effect and the schooling. So what is being left out and how does it differ from the twin study? Because the twin study also controls for like the genetic and also like what's the difference?
Yeah, so a couple of things. It's not perfectly measuring everything that's family background. It's everything that's shared by siblings. So suppose you're a parent and your parenting behavior is different between your two kids, right? That's not going to be captured in the correlation because it's not common. But we might think of parenting practices as part of family background. So it's everything that's not shared, essentially. So it's what happened is there was a literature in sociology that tried to understand how important is family background. So they would run these regressions where they would put in every variable they could observe in a data set. And this sociologist, Christopher Jenks at Harvard, really was I think, maybe the first person to come up with this idea. Rather than worrying about missing variables, why don't we just look at siblings, and then that will tell us everything about family background. So that was the origins of it. Economists haven't used it a lot. I'm one of the people who like it, and for example, Anders Bjorklund in Sweden, this is his favorite measure, and he thinks economists should be running more studies of sibling correlations because conceptually he thinks it answers the more interesting thing about the contribution of all of the things about families to inequality, not just your income, okay? And so, but it's debatable. Now, in terms of twins is typically taken, so we should distinguish between a twin correlation, which would be an analog to a sibling correlation, and twins effects models, which if we have time, I'll talk about a little bit. Where there you're using it as an identification strategy where you want to hold constant and difference out what's common between twins, and the idea is you're trying to get rid of all of the genetic influences. Now, if you ran a twin correlation, you would be trying to say what's everything shared in common by twins, which is maybe even taking, there's a trade-off. On the one hand, it's maybe more closely capturing family background things because at the same age you're going to experience a lot of the same things. On the other hand, it's less clear that it's generalizable to the importance of family background to the sample of non-twins. So I think loosely first order, though, that would be the trade-off. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
So when you talk about the sibling correlation, the actually compared with other sibling.
Yes, so age, right. So typically what we do is we age adjust it. Now there might be some issues with that, but at a first order of approximation, if you thought, in my survey, I observed this sibling at 31 and that sibling at 38, and I pool everybody in the sample and I fit an age profile, and then I take the residuals from that, that would be quote unquote adjusting for it. Now, there could be a concern, I'm going to talk about in a little later, this idea of life cycle bias, where if people, if the age at which your income is measured as a kid is not reflective of your permanent income. So say you're going to graduate school and I measure your income at age 23, and all the people who have lower income at age 23 are people who are going to end up having very high income because they're taking a hit to invest in human capital, then I'm going to induce a bias. So this is one issue that comes up in the intergenerational mobility literature, but it could also come up in the sibling literature. If I'm measuring one sibling at 23 and the other at 40, one's really at their permanent income and the other isn't. And that could institute a bias, even if I take the residuals from fitting the curve. It's really fundamentally about the different trajectories in income that are induced by age. Does that make sense? We'll talk about that some more. Okay. All right. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is try to get through this first paper in the next 10 minutes, or even wherever we stop, we'll stop. So the first paper is by Gary Solon in 1992. And I think it's a nice paper to run through because this basically influenced a lot of the literature out to the recent work by Chetty et al. In terms of fundamentally how they approach the question and choose samples and think about measurement. Okay. So I'll go through this quickly, but he talked about in the introduction how the early studies in the US estimated intergenerational elasticities or correlations to be about 0.2 or less, and points out, in a presidential address that Gary Becker gave, because of this research, he concluded in all these countries, low earnings as well as high earnings are not strongly transmitted from fathers to sons. And he thought regression to the mean was very rapid, and therefore that intergenerational mobility was very rapid. But there are important econometric issues that Solon first talked about. And so this comes back to the earlier question, where we think our object of interest is permanent income of kids and their parents, and measured in logs. But what if the data we actually have are individual years of income, not permanent income? What happens? So here what you have is individual year income indexed by T for the kids, indexed by S for the parents, where you can think of it as the permanent income plus some transitory fluctuation around that permanent income. Okay. What would that do to the regression coefficient? So the probability limit of rho hat would be equal to the true rho times this ratio of the variance in permanent income to the total variance in income. Okay, and because the denominator here is going to have more variance than the numerator, this is going to be a downward biased estimate. Okay, and similarly, you can see the implication on the correlation coefficient, which is going to also have this ratio. And so basically shows that using individual years of income rather than permanent income will give you downward bias estimates. Now, when Solon wrote the paper in 1992, that was at about the time at which this first US intergenerational data could now get a national sample where you could look at multiple years of income for parents and kids. And basically shows that if you don't time average and you just have a single year, you have this lambda attenuation factor. But if you use the time averaging, that attenuation factor starts to get reduced. So the larger is this cap t. And importantly, in the regression context, all we really care about is parent income because that's on the right-hand side, which is inducing the measurement error. The larger that cap t is, the smaller this denominator gets. And so the attenuation factor becomes smaller, and so the row hat will now become closer to the true row. So that was the key idea. I'm going to skip this. This talks about just sample selection issues, etc. It's not super important. So what is he going to do? The main specification is basically going to regress kids' income on parents' income and control for quadratic in age, and use time averages for age and for parent income denoted by these bars. Okay? Okay, and I just should give an aside. In the Solon paper, as well as all of the literature that follows, we don't put other controls in this regression. We don't put parent education or neighborhood characteristics or anything like that. Okay, and so you might ask, why don't we do that? And the idea is that essentially, again, this is a descriptive parameter, not a causal parameter. We're not trying to say what's the causal effect of increasing parent income on kid income. It's saying everything that's caught up, that's correlated with parent income, what's that association? So that goes back to the sibling correlation in some sense, because even though we're using parent income, that coefficient is capturing everything correlated with parent income. And if we actually want a broad measure, that's another reason to maybe use the sibling correlation. Okay. So what were the estimates? So what Gary Solon did was he showed what happens if you use a single year of parents' log earnings measured for each of these 5 years, and then just regressed it on a single year, a single year of kids' earnings, and these would be the 5 estimates you get. Then what he did was he took a 2-year average of each of these 2 sequential years and showed what the estimates would be, and then a 3-year average, then a 4-year average, and then a 5-year average. And you can see that while it's a little bit noisy, on average you move from estimates in the 0.2 to 0.3 range to an estimate of over 0.4. And so this was the evidence that Gary Becker was talking about when he said mobility was very rapid in the United States. And then with longitudinal data and correcting for measurement error, we now got an estimate that was maybe double the size. Okay, and so he showed that measurement error, and I want to talk about it, but also the fact that some of these studies use very homogeneous samples, exaggerated mobility, using better data got you an intergenerational correlation of 0.4 or higher, and so there was much less mobility than previously thought. Okay, and interestingly, at the same time, in the same volume of the AER, was a similar paper by Zimmerman using a different data set called the National Longitudinal Survey that found a similar result. Okay, so why don't I stop here because we're close to a break, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I left off finishing Gary Solon's paper, and you know the advantage of giving a lecture on a topic is you can always talk about your own paper, your own work very easily. So the second paper I'm going to talk about is my dissertation paper that got published in 2005 in Restat, which really, to be very honest, just basically builds on what Gary Solon had already done. But there are a few interesting wrinkles as the literature had progressed from the early 90s. Okay. Oop. So basically, I'm going to just run, you already have seen this idea. I motivated the analysis by this idea of how many generations does it take for gaps in society to be wiped out. And I used the Becker-Tomes quote here. Based on that 0.2, they argued that all gaps would be wiped out in 3 generations. And this is sort of a simple calculation, but it assumes that this persistence parameter is an AR1 process, so you take 0.2 and you cube it, and in 3 generations, what you're left with in terms of persistence is very small. Solon's finding of a 0.4 makes it a bit bigger, but what if the IG is even higher? Okay, and so I give this example of if you thought about a family living in poverty in the US and you took that parameter, if the IgE was 0.4, it would take the descendants of that family about 3 generations to be, on average, very close to the mean income. But if the IgE was more like 0.6, it would take 5 or 6 generations. Okay? And so what I argued is an IgE of 0.6 paints a radically different picture of intergenerational mobility in the US. Okay, and so how do I basically giving away the story? I'm going to estimate a 0.6. How do I get there? The key insight was that what if transitory fluctuations in income persist? What happens when they're serially correlated, and are they serially correlated? In that situation, even the short-term averages, like Gary Solon had of 5 years, would still lead to downward biased estimates. So suppose that Y01 that we saw earlier, okay, had this transitory component W in each generation, but now that there's this delta parameter, that it's serially correlated, and if this is your regression of interest, what happens to the rho hat in the presence of this delta parameter? Okay, and basically now the p-lim is equal to rho times an attenuation factor that before was that ratio of the variance in permanent income to the variance in total income, including the transitory component. And we saw earlier that when you use the time average, as cap t increased, you would reduce that denominator. Now, essentially, you find that same pattern with this alpha component. And this alpha term looks like a fairly complicated expression, but it's basically a function of delta. And when delta is equal to 0, this whole thing just becomes 1, and we're left back in the Gary Solon land, where a simple time average averages things away. But if delta is sizable, then this alpha term becomes more important, and it's not so clear that increasing t a small amount will get rid of a lot of that measurement error. Okay, so what happens to that reliability ratio, or lambda, as you increase the time average of parents' income? So if you just use some basic parameters from the literature on earnings dynamics, where, say, that delta, the serial correlation in transitory shocks, is 0.5. So I did this based on the literature in the 1990s, papers like David Card had written on, About and Card had a nice paper on earnings dynamics, and this is sort of the kind of results they would get. And if you thought that the share of total variation in income that was from permanent income was about 0.5, so if you took these assumptions, the lambda you would get from just using a single year would be 0.5. So that would say if the true IgE was 0.6 and you just used a single year of parent income, you would get a 0.3 because the reliability ratio would be a half. But if you used a 5-year average, you would still get a reliability ratio less than 0.7. So that would suggest that if using that 5-year average got you an intergenerational elasticity of 0.4, you should still be inflating that by an additional 1 over 0.7 to get the true estimate of the intergenerational elasticity. And just using this simple model suggests that as you increase cap t, the reliability ratio is gradually asymptoting to the true value, but it takes a very long time. Okay? But it looks like once you get to something like 15 to 20 years, you're going to get a pretty good read on the rho parameter. Okay. Second point that I would make from the study I did in Restad is that I argued that previous studies used fathers' income at ages when the reliability ratio was relatively low. So this chart is assuming that there's nothing here is a function of the age of fathers. This is all saying that the transitory fluctuations are the same if I measured the dads when they're 40 as when I measured the dads when they're 60. Okay, and basically I show using some tax data and running my own earnings dynamics model, as well as some work that Gary Solon had done with Michael Baker using Canadian tax data, that you get this kind of U-shaped pattern in the transitory fluctuations in earnings, and that those transitory fluctuations, that variance is reduced quite a bit at the middle of the life cycle. And this kind of makes intuitive sense. If you measure your income in your 20s, that's not necessarily as good a signal. You may not be in the occupation you're going to end up being at. When you start to look at later ages, this is maybe driven by health shocks, other kinds of issues that happen with aging. And so what the sweet spot where you really want to reduce the variance of transitory fluctuations is in the early 40s. Okay, so what happens when you add this component? So that's the second issue. A third issue that is not really in my Restat paper, but this is sort of a natural place to talk about again. I briefly talked about in answer to one of the questions in the first half about life cycle bias, is a paper by Steve Hayter and Gary Solon in the AER, where basically they pointed out that this issue I talked about, where there are differing life cycle patterns in income. And for the people who have low earnings in their 20s, if they are on average, people end up having higher permanent income, then what happens is when you estimate this IGE using sons at an early age, this comes out of their model of a lambda coefficient, that ends up being giving you a very downward biased estimate that also tends to kind of average out. You get a reliability ratio of around 1 in the late 30s, early 40s. So three things. Time averaging, you need really long time averages of parent income. You need to measure the parents at a key point in the life cycle to reduce the transitory noise. And you also want to measure the son's income at a point at which this so-called life cycle bias is also reduced, also in their early 40s. Okay, so these are the results that I found in my paper using Social Security earnings, where I could observe people over very long panels. And I show that basically using a 2-year versus a 4-year versus a 7-year versus a 10-year and then versus a 16-year time average, you get the estimates monotonically increasing for both sons and daughters. And if you pool them, you essentially get an estimate of an IGE of 0.6. Okay? And if you plot those estimates, against that simple model that's based on just a couple of parameters that I showed you earlier, and under the assumption that the true IGE is 0.7, because remember, even a 15, 16-year average was getting you a 0.9 reliability, the numbers line up pretty well. And so I show a couple of variations based on the age range I use. But this basically shows you that using a single year would give you an IGE of around 0.3. Using a 5-year average would give you IGEs in the 0.4 to 0.5 range. and using 15, 16 years would give you an IGE of around 0.6. Okay. Any questions about this? I think it's fairly straightforward. But so the point was that, you know, even the 0.4 might be biased down. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Chetty et al. QJE paper, Where is the Land of Opportunity, the Geography of Intergenerational Mobility. And, you know, I should say this is also with Nathan Hendren, Pat Klein, and Emmanuel Saez. And this is, they were motivated by the idea of whether, you know, everything I've showed you so far from Solon and my work is using the United States as a whole. But is there this variation across the country? And basically, the previous studies haven't had the sample size to do this. So the Solon paper was using something like 300 father-son pairs. My samples were maybe 2,000 father-son pairs at the largest. What did they do? They were able to get tax data on millions of individuals from the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. That's the tax collection authority in the United States. And so they could hone in on very small geographic areas. And basically, the key finding of the paper is that there are vast differences in intergenerational mobility across these places. And this implies that there's no one simple answer to the question of whether intergenerational mobility is low or too low in the US. Their argument is that it depends where you're looking at in the US. Okay. They also introduced a somewhat newer methodology. So they focus more on family income, whereas in my paper I had access to just labor market earnings. And they make the point that the IGE estimates are very sensitive to how you handle children with zero income. Now, I'll come back to this a little bit in the next paper of mine that I'm going to talk about. But basically, they find in their data, they're measuring kids in 2010, 2011, a few years after the Great Recession, when unemployment was still relatively high in the US, and you have many kids with zero in their income. And the log-log specification introduces this issue. What do you do with people with zero income? And they basically argue that depending on how you treat them, you can get wildly different estimates ranging from like 0.2 to 0.6. Okay, so what do? Instead, they decide to use ranks, okay? And they use the rank of parents and the rank of kids, and they basically think about the rank slope as a measure of persistence in income ranks, which we talked about. I think that was the third measure in the first half today. And then they also use this measure of what is your expected rank if your parents' income was at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. And they call this absolute mobility, which is a little bit strange because it's sort of a rank-based measure. Yes. What's their measure?
Zero income. Does it mean earnings, or it's literally just?
It's literally so they have like an algorithm which includes earnings. It includes certain government transfers. It includes investment income. Yeah, they're showing a zero for everything. And so, you know, that's the issue. Then what happens? Now, one common thing is people just drop the zeros and you estimate it. You could impute them under different assumptions, like that maybe, you know, some people thought, well, there's like a baseline consumption level that you could assign people, or, you know. So they say that the results are very sensitive to the choice you make there. I'll come back to this because I think it is strange. And the argument I'm going to make, just to foreshadow, is that part of this is a function of the data you have available. Like, so if you were doing the same study in Sweden or Norway, you wouldn't just pick 2 years to look at kid income, you would look at their whole lifespan. And by then, you're not going to observe zeros in every year. So I think 90% of the issue goes away. Yes. Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, it could be that, so the way it works is they find parents who filed a tax form in some set of years. They put their kids down as a dependent, and then they can find that kid in later years. So if they have anything related to the tax system, I think even if they didn't file a return, I think, I'm not totally sure. I think whether or not this is only conditional on filing a return, it might be that even if your parent, like the college tax form that you fill out simply for attending a college might show up in the data as a zero income if there's no labor market earnings. But of course, there's many other things. There could be underreporting of income. So there are a lot of issues in this zero issue. But, it's a seemingly persuasive case because if you look at their tables, you get these widely varying estimates. And so they say, we shouldn't use the IGE, we should use this rank slope. Okay. Okay. So then the slope and the intercept together can characterize one of these regions. And then the next thing they show is that this rank relationship is remarkably linear. So I'll show you that right here. This is basically taking bins of child income rank for each of the 100 percentiles of parent income, and you see that it falls really nicely on this line. And so that means that rather than having to do some non-parametric thing, they could simply characterize mobility by the slope of this line and the intercept. They don't literally use the intercept, but they use the intercept, that at the 25th percentile of parent income. And so they have these two parameters that they can reduce everything to. And then they can show you charts like the following. What if we just look at kids who grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah versus Charlotte, North Carolina? What is the rank relationship? Now, to be clear, these kids could be living anywhere in the United States. The cities are defined by where they grew up. And you see if you grew up in Charlotte, there's this very steep rank slope. And the expected percentile if you grew up in Charlotte would be somewhere around 35th percentile. But if you grew up in Salt Lake City, your expected rank would be like the 45th percentile. And the relationship between your parent income rank and your rank would be much flatter. So, and at almost every percentile in the distribution, except maybe at the very top, your expected rank would be higher if you grew up in Salt Lake City versus Charlotte. There's sort of an interesting issue in other city comparisons. These lines might cross. And then you might have an issue where mobility is good for the bottom of the distribution, but maybe at the very top of the distribution, being in a particular city might give you more mobility at some points of the distribution, but worse mobility at other points. And then how do you treat those differences? And that's where this idea of using weights and a social welfare function could potentially add up these mobility differences and give you something. Now, they don't really do any of that in their study. They simply show you these kinds of patterns. So then they plot this for the entire country by these small geographic areas called commuting zones that include kind of both rural and urban parts of counties. And what you see is the dark red are areas where in this case, I'm showing you the rank slope, where the slopes are very high, and the yellow to white areas are where they are very low. And they basically make the point that there's a lot of heterogeneity. So they would, for example, point to two bordering states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, where in a lot of Pennsylvania you have more rapid mobility, and in Ohio you have less rapid mobility. And they would sort of try to make the point you know, these are bordering states. What is it that's different about Ohio from Pennsylvania? Is there something we can learn from this heterogeneity that could tell us what makes for an area to have more rapid mobility than another area? The other striking finding that you can kind of see is that there are these areas in the Midwest, but really mainly in the South, the southern belt, where mobility is relatively low. Okay, and so they kind of make the point that, you know, there's much lower mobility in the South. Okay, so what do they then do? Now they have this data set of mobility at this low level of geography. They can run correlations of mobility with all sorts of different measures. Okay, and so these are the kinds of results they get. So they first set of measures are things dealing with segregation. And you can see that the correlations with their measure of upward mobility, which is the expected rank at the 25th percentile of parent income, you know, are in the 0.4 to 0.5 range. If you look at income inequality, they vary a bit. If you look at educational measures, you know, they again are in the maybe 0.3 to 0.6 range with large standard errors. And so you can map out all of these things. So for example, some of these are tax policy estimates, don't appear to be highly associated. So this gives you an idea of a first order, you know, what are potentially the important factors driving mobility. So in addition to getting these heterogeneity by geography, they can use this geographic variation to start to think about more deeply about what are the mechanisms behind intergenerational mobility. Okay, and so they come up with these 5 key factors based on the earlier chart: segregation, inequality, school quality, social capital, and family structure. They argue against race being a key factor. So a lot of Americans, when you look at that chart, you think, you know, African Americans, Black Americans live predominantly in the South, or did earlier in the 20th century. So is this just driven by a composition of race? Because in other work, you know, for example, the research I showed you that I did showed you that mobility is lower. And they basically say that even if you looked only at areas that were largely white, you would see a similar pattern. Okay. Now, an important caveat to all of this is this paper is not about any causal evidence. The variables here are all likely endogenous, and the regressions might have measurement error. So this is just kind of still in the descriptive set of results. In some other work that Chetty and Hendren are doing, they're trying to identify causal estimates of where you grew up based on looking at movers, people who move from one area to another, and how much exposure, how old were they when they moved. But in this paper, that's not what's being done. Okay, so let me go back. Sorry. So any questions about the Chetty et al. Paper? I simplified like a 60-page paper into 5 slides.
We consider the correlation for after tax, and we also, when we measure it includes the transfer government transfers.
Yes, so they are using pre-tax income with some transfers included. Not all transfers. So, you know, it might be worth like a discussion, a brief discussion about what do we want to actually measure? Okay, and the way I think about it, there may be many other answers, but I think of at least 2 things we might want to measure. In an ideal world, we think we have utility over consumption. So maybe what we really want to measure is your consumption, or in the absence of good consumption, something about your consumption possibilities. And that might then be like your disposable income, where you do post-tax, post-transfer and look at that object, okay? And that might be the object of interest. And this relates to the zeros issue. Because if you have zero income, does that really mean you have zero consumption? Okay, and then you could use other data to inform what's really your consumption possibilities. And then that might be a sensible way to impute. Okay, and then that might say, rather than a wide range of estimates, let's use the one related to your consumption possibilities. Another lens on intergenerational mobility is we're maybe interested in skills and what's the transmission of skills. And then often we might want to be thinking about wages as a measure, if that's reflecting your return in the labor, your return to skills in the labor market, that's the object we want to measure, is your earnings ability. And then if you report a zero, maybe you have a different set of arguments. So maybe you use the minimum wage, or you use some other imputation mechanism that captures your skill level. But to be honest, in some of these studies, I didn't show you, like Solon's work, he focused on annual earnings, but also showed results with family income. Same in my paper, I use various different measures of income. Think a little bit on this with the idea that we're agnostic. We don't really know what's the right way to do it. So we show a variety of them. One of the dangers with relying on administrative data, in the US, this is now hugely revolutionized applied micro because we have access to lots of administrative data from the government now, like the Chetty work. There, you only collect the data that's useful for administrative purposes. Okay, so they put in transfers, but only the transfers that are relevant to tax policy that are measured by the IRS. So it gets at this issue, well, why are we just picking some transfers and not others? It's not really driven by a conceptual interest, but just this measurement issue. And even though the PSID, you only may be getting a few hundred father-son pairs, you can look at exactly the income you want to look at. Okay, so there's a case to be made that we shouldn't completely throw out survey data, even though we're in this age of millions of observations with administrative data because of this kind of question. Okay. Yeah.
I think that land of opportunity is also the land of risk, right?
Land of
Opportunity is also land of risk.
Land of race.
Because the family with the high income has the more possible to drop into the low level.
Oh, because the blacks the downward mobility is higher. Yeah, so I'll tell you, I'm not going to show you this, but I have some work that I'm currently working on that makes the argument that race and region together are important. So in their map, I'll just go back to that. Oh, I keep going the wrong direction. Here they don't have race in the tax data because it's just not collected. So you don't know the race of individuals. So they have to look at.
No. I didn't say race. I say risk.
Oh, risk.
Yeah,
sorry.
Risk.
Okay. Okay, so your point is that in the U.S., there's more instability, and your income you're more likely to you can rise or fall, and that's the
slope is high. Then the people in the low percentile with higher income are more likely to drop to the low income because the high slope.
So you're saying it's something a function of the
Try to use the rank as the measure. So
yeah. That's right.
if you rank high, then in the next year you'll probably drop to the low rank because the high slope. opportunity. On the other hand, is a risk of dropping for the high income or high rank family.
Yeah, so here, I mean, this is sort of saying that wherever your rank, your starting rank, you're more likely to end up at that rank than if this line were flatter. So I'm going to show you a picture later where if this were Sweden or Norway, this slope is about 0.35 here. I think it would, with a better estimate than what they have would be more like 0.4. And in Sweden, Norway, this would be 0.2. So actually, the persistence of rank is lower in those other countries with, I think so I'm not sure. I think that would say there's more like stability in rank in the US. I thought you were going to, but yeah, so I don't think it follows from the slope being high that mobility is or opportunity is more rapid. I don't know if, maybe I'm misunderstanding your point. Okay, we could talk more later. Okay. So I think this was it's an excellent paper, but there was a particular part of the paper that I really didn't like, given what I showed you with Solon's work and my earlier work on measurement. And they basically, one part of their paper argues that the IGE is actually something like 0.34 and similar to the rank-rank slope. And they basically say that none of these measurement concerns that I talked to you about, taking longer time averages of parent income, the life cycle bias that Heider and Solon pointed out, where if you had kids in their 20s versus kids in their 40s, or this age-specific transitory variances, that didn't apply in their data. Okay, they basically argued that since they have tax data, they have kind of the truth, and that all those measurement issues go away. Okay, and it's not a big, most of their paper is about this geographic differences in the rank-rank. But I thought this was important since this is going to be an incredibly widely read paper, and it was basically saying that all of this research on measurement issues, in the era of tax data, we don't need to worry about this anymore. And my paper in particular, they have an appendix section saying it's the 0.6 is flawed. So I wanted to write a paper to kind of make sure that people didn't come away with that. Okay, and they claim the zeros issue. Okay, so what did I do? So basically, I wanted to make 2 points. One is that there's a difference between conceptually what we want to measure and whether there are robustness issues with measurement. So I said all that already. I'm not going to say that again. But I think another point that they kind of glossed over that's important is that even if their IGE was perfectly robust, you wouldn't want to show the IGE within city for exactly the same reason that I showed you in that example of the IGE within blacks versus IGE within whites, right? If you're regressing to a different mean in Charlotte versus Salt Lake City, it's a little bit of it's not an apples to apples comparison. So I think one important point is because they were looking at subgroup differences, that's a reason to look at ranks relative to the whole distribution, I think. But they don't make that point, but I think that's an important point to make. Okay, so on the measurement issues, to set up what I do in this paper to explain why I think their thinking is wrong and is driven by the tax data they have, is I start by thinking about what would be the ideal data set. And this is kind of like what you could get in Sweden, Norway, Denmark. The exact ages aren't exactly clear, but you want something like to measure the entire life cycle. So maybe this should be 18 to 65 or 18 to 70, but suppose you thought it was this 31 years between 25 to 55. And you wanted to observe that for an entire cohort of kids, right? you would want, and suppose the last data in your data set was 2012, like in the tax data that Chetty et al. Have, then you'd want to go back to 1982, and you would want all of these years of kids' income. And then for parents, if you similarly wanted them from 25 to 55, you would want the data going back to 1957. Okay, that would be the ideal setup where you'd have life cycles for both generations. Okay, that's the kind of range of data you would need. So it makes the point that studying intergenerational mobility is very data intensive to do it correctly. Now, we don't have that. What you need is a very long-running panel, okay? And what I do here is to kind of show you that, you know, this is visually the data you would ideally have, and this is the data that Chetty et al. Actually use. So they're measuring kids' income in 2 years when they're 30, I think actually like 29 to 32, but just a 2-year average centered around these years. And then they have a distribution of parent income around these ages, but a huge this is sort of the mean in their data, is 44 to 48 when they're measuring father's income over 5 years. And they're saying, like, if we use longer averages here, it doesn't matter. If we use kids here versus here, it doesn't matter. And so those previous issues didn't matter. What I'm going to do is basically use data from the PSID, small samples. I'm not going to look across the country, but I'm going to use center time averages around age 40 and use longer time averages for dads and kids. And then what I can do is mimic this data. I could take the PSID, compute the estimates of the IGE, and then I could say, what if I made my data look like the Chetty et al. Data? Would I get estimates similar to theirs? Okay, and then the other exercises I can do is, and I'll basically show you some of this, is that they do some exercises where they say, well, we looked at older age kids, but we didn't find that the IGE increased the way the life cycle bias did. But they weren't holding fixed father's age. And the problem is that, the point I should make actually is that the reason their data is set up like this is because the tax data only goes back to 1996, not 1957. And because the data only goes back to 1996, they can't look at fathers earlier in the life cycle. And when they want to look at kids who are older, they have to mechanically look at parents' income when they're older. If they want to, and if they want to use longer time averages, they can't go backwards. They have to go forwards, precisely at the point where the transitory variance in income for fathers is very high. Okay, so I'll walk you through this. I'll just skip this. Okay, so the results I'm going to show you here, the table is going to have longer time averages of father's income going down here and time averages of son income going across the row. Okay, and the very first estimate, if you just use a single year of father's income in the PSID and son's income close to age 40, you get an estimate of 0.41. So this is a lot like the Gary Solon estimate. This is already higher than the 0.34 estimate that's in the Chetty paper. Okay, and then what I find is as you increase the time average of son's income, there's no clear pattern. The estimates are between 0.35 and 0.42, but you lose sample size because of attrition. There's some people that only report in some years. So one thing you could do is do a weighted average of these estimates, and you get something like 0.38. Then if you start looking down a particular column, you see the same pattern that I found with the Social Security data in my 2005 paper, where the estimates get higher and higher. When you get to a 5-year average, you get to 0.53. You get to even above 0.6 when you use longer time averages. And two differences here between this paper and that paper. One is the concept here is family income, whereas before I was looking at labor market earnings. And also now I'm using centered time averages around age 40. Okay, so basically this is consistent with sort of your textbook econometrics of classical measurement error. Only the right-hand side matters for bias. Once we've centered at age 40, there is no issue of life cycle bias. So I can basically reproduce estimates in the PSID like previous research. And basically I could show you this for any combination. And what I highlighted here was, this is the estimate if you use 2 years of sons and 5 years of fathers, like in Chetty et al., you get a 0.5 instead of their 0.34. But now what I can do is make the averages match their ages. So what I'm going to do now is show you a 2-year average when the kids are around age 30 and when the dads are around 44 to 48. Okay? And if you do that, you get estimates of around 0.28 or 0.33, depending on which sample you use. So I could essentially show how, when you use the ideal data for a two-year and a 5-year average, you go from 0.5 to around 0.3. So I can essentially replicate the Chetty estimates by imposing their data restrictions that you have in the IRS. Okay, does that make sense? So basically, they argue it doesn't matter, but I show you that it does, and you can show this in survey data. Okay? All right. I think so. That's less. Any questions about this? So again, you know, their work is an excellent paper that shows you the importance of geographic differences. I do a similar exercise with the rank slope, and there the differences aren't as big. With the IGE, there is definitely an issue that it's more sensitive to the time averages and where in the life cycle. But even with the rank slope, you could get an estimate of about 0.34, but if you use the full range of data, you get estimates more like in the low 0.4s. So there is still a bias, but it's not as big. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to just talk a little bit about some other evidence from other countries. This is the chart that I referred to earlier, the Great Gatsby curve. So it's kind of a funny name for non-Americans. The Great Gatsby is a book by this writer, F. Scott Fitzgerald, written in the 20s, or written about the 1920s. I'm not sure if it's written in the 20s. Yeah, in the 20s. And that was another period of very very high inequality in the US. And I think that was the term was come up with by somebody in the White House who is working in the Council of Economic Advisors to show this relationship that economist Miles Korak had basically shown in a paper, that countries where income inequality was higher, measured by the Gini coefficient, the intergenerational elasticity was higher. And so there was less mobility as you went up the y-axis. Okay, and so there was a lot of debate about whether this is, you know, a causal relationship or if this is some kind of spurious relationship. I just mainly wanted to show this to you to point out just kind of the descriptive facts that this shows you the U.S. has one of the highest inequality and highest IGEs. I'm not sure exactly where China, I was hoping to, before this lecture, read up on the China evidence. I know there are a few studies, but I think the problem is that you don't have really good income data for both generations. So there are studies using occupation to infer income and some provinces and in some time periods. So I don't know that you could get a clean estimate, but you could probably, I'm guessing the inequality is pretty high. But yeah. Sorry?
It's out of the picture.
Yeah, it's not. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Can you say something about what you think the value of these cross-country comparisons actually is? Seems to be a bit controversial. This comes up in other areas too, like in growth theory, for instance, and things like this.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of them personally, but it motivates a lot of other people, so I feel like it's important. I've done some cross-country studies just to kind of, I try to be careful to sort of say, these are what you get. Whether this is something, some of it I think is going to be about, I think the value is to sort of say, can we then use this to say something about what is this about institutions that are driving these differences or not? And then it could be one piece among many in maybe that building up that case, but I wouldn't want to use it as the determinative factor. But I think I also wanted to put up other cross-country evidence because so much of what I'm talking about is US driven. Okay, and as we move forward, there are going to be many more mobility estimates for many more countries. I'm currently working on getting a better estimate for us, Australia, right now. Okay, this is to show you that the conditional, the rank slope, basically. If you linearize it, how that differs, just to give you an example again of how the US, that slope is much steeper compared to these other European countries where you get slopes of around 0.2. Okay, and then I also wanted to make a point that, even if you look, Chetty et al. Make this point that, well, there's a lot of heterogeneity, but it's really difficult to find US cities where the rank slope is similar to what you have in these other countries. So this may, I guess if one of you can do this for China, that would be really cool. Okay. Here, an alternative way to look at across countries and to look at developing countries and more countries is to look at parent-child schooling correlations, to look at education. So most of my talk I've deliberately focused on income, but there's a lot of literature looking at education, looking at occupation, and I'm starting to work on looking at health, intergenerational health correlations and associations. This is a paper by Tom Hertz and a lot of other co-authors that tries to standardize the education correlations and the education on education coefficients across many different countries. And again, I don't think China is included on here. Okay, so a little more than half an hour. I'm going to talk a little bit now about identification strategies that try to estimate a causal intergenerational effect. Okay, and I think this research is going to be expanding a lot in the coming years. There are not that many good studies because there are few, if any, good exogenous sources of income. So, it's hard to find an example where suddenly a family gets a lot of income randomly given to them. Maybe there's a lottery winner that gets income, but it's really hard to find. So some of the attempts that have tried to look at intergenerational causal effects have used bundled interventions. By that I mean it's more than just income. So there's a nice paper by Phil Oriopoulos and co-authors that looks at mass layoffs. That's when whole companies lay off lots of workers, and then they say, what's the effect on kids' income? But you're going to worry that a mass layoff is going to have other kind of stress effects, health effects. Maybe it affects family structure. Maybe the parents get divorced. There are a lot of things that happen when you lose a job that could be more than just losing the income. Okay, it's still not to say that it's not interesting, but it's going to be much harder to pin down the mechanism. So I think there's a lot more to be done. What I'm going to talk about is what I think the best causal evidence is not by using intergenerational associations, but research using education associations. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper by Holmlund et al. In the Journal of Economic Literature in 2011. I think it's a very nice paper. I'm going to really condense it, but if you have an opportunity, I think it's a really good paper, particularly if you're interested in using these new research designs to try to identify causal effects, because it does a really good job of talking through various assumptions relating to both internal validity and external validity, which often gets ignored in these papers. So, you know, one thing I want to leave you with is just coming up with a cool identification strategy is not enough. You really have to carefully think through the validity issues and the external validity issues. And I'll walk you through some examples. Okay, so this is the paper I'm going to talk about a little bit. And basically, what they do is they start with a literature review of other papers that have tried to identify the causal effect of parent education on children's education. And they think about 3 different identification strategies. One is to use twin differences, where one parent and another parent are twins. One has more education than the other. And then they look at the kids, the kids who are cousins, and see what's the difference in education in the kid generation, with the idea that we talked about earlier in one of the questions, that the twin difference is going to control for all of the, you know, common influences, all the fixed family characteristics, and the difference is going to be something that's exogenous. The second strategy is going to use adoption. The idea is that if parents adopt a child, you've cut off now the genetic influence. Now you're looking at what happens, what's the relationship between, you know, a parent that shares nothing genetically in common with the kid that they adopt. Maybe that association is going to be smaller, and you can think of that as the causal effect. The third type of study is using compulsory schooling reform as an instrumental variable. And this is, I know I've seen many papers using China as a setting for compulsory schooling, so this might be of interest as well. And the idea there is, if the instrument is valid, if a change in the law made some people in some cohorts more likely to get a year of education versus another neighboring birth cohort, now let's look at the kids of those 2 cohort groups. The kids get more years of schooling as well. Okay, so what they do is they talk through each method, and then for each study they compare the results between OLS and the research design, and then they discuss some of the internal, external validity issues. So first I'm just going to talk about what their summary of the existing literature, and then they're going to go on to do their own empirical work that I'll talk about. So it's helpful to start with the baseline OLS model, where you have the schooling of child I from family J, and we're interested in this delta 1 parameter, which is this intergenerational association with the parent, okay? And, you know, if this schooling was purely exogenous, then delta 1 would be that causal effect. Of course, in OLS, we're typically thinking that this parent schooling is correlated with the error term in the regression. You might think there are 2 components, a U and an epsilon, and maybe the epsilon is random, but this U component is correlated, so you might get like an upward biased estimate. You know, a typical story would be, say, if more motivated parents who have certain characteristics, psychological traits that they pass on to their kids also get more schooling, and the kids get more schooling because of these traits, maybe they're more motivated, then delta 1 would be biased. Okay, so the idea is, how do we come up with a unbiased estimate. So the twin model is to try to say, let's look at the difference between the education levels of the twin parents, and then look at the association, this delta 1 twin, on the difference in education between the cousins, the kids of the two twin parents. Okay, and the key assumption is that you're differencing out this motivation difference, because you're saying that these twins likely had the same kind of characteristics, and once you get rid of that, you either entirely, eliminate the bias, or maybe you go a long ways towards eliminating the bias. Now, I may come back to this, but this is also, this is not a foolproof. There's a nice paper by Bound and Solon that challenged this assumption. They basically make the argument that, if twins are so similar that you can difference everything, then why do they even have different levels of education, right? There's something that causes one twin to get more education than the other. And there is this biological literature showing that, the twin that's more advantaged in utero and has higher birth weight ends up getting more education. So maybe you're not really differencing out something important. You're still capturing some variation that has to do with an omitted variable. So it's not foolproof. If you look at adoption studies, the idea is that now you're looking at the schooling of the adoptive parent, not the actual natural-born parent. And now the idea is that maybe you're getting rid of that U term, if that U term was correlated with the natural-born parent but not the adoptive parent. Okay, of course, the assumption is that the adoption was random, but you might, question that. The adoption is typically not going to be random. Maybe parents have some ability to pick up on the characteristics and have choice over the kid they will adopt, or if maybe you adopt a kid in your family because the parents passed away, you're going to still share some genetic traits. So short of a randomization of the adoption, you might question this assumption as well. Okay, and then in terms of IV, what you would do now is you would have two equations. You would have a first stage equation where you would predict parent schooling based on this reform, and then you would regress the kid's schooling based on the predicted value of the parent's schooling in this sort of typical two-stage least squares. And I'm sure you guys have learned the typical assumptions for IV, that you need the exclusion restriction to hold, that the schooling reform had no effect on the children's schooling except through the parent's level of schooling, and that this has a strong enough first stage so that it's not biased towards OLS. Okay, and so you might worry about things like, suppose the areas that got the schooling reform were better advantaged areas in other ways, and those other aspects that are correlated with the reform had an independent effect on kids' schooling. So all of these have some internal validity assumptions that the paper carefully goes through. Okay, so overall they find, first of all, there's not a lot of available evidence. There's maybe something in the order of 5 or so studies when they wrote this of each type of estimation strategy. You often got conflicting results. If you used, for example, a sample of military twins in the US, you might get a different result than using twins in Norway. Okay, and when you look across the estimation methods, you sometimes got different estimates that could be due to different biases across the different identification strategies. It could also be due to differences in external validity. Maybe twins in the US military are not representative of the causal effect of education for a nationally representative sample of all Americans. Okay, so this is all by way of motivating what they end up doing, which is to focus on one country with one data set and use all three approaches together. Okay, and so what they're going to do is use this with Swedish data and get a very large national sample of cohorts that were exposed to the school reform, where then they can find twins and they can also find adopted kids. So they still managed to get some reasonably large samples. They use twins that are same-sex twin. They use kids where they're children of same-sex twin parents. About half are monozygotic, okay? So this means they shared the same egg in the womb as opposed to two different fertilized eggs. And I don't think they actually know zygosity in the data. This is by assumption based on what you expect based on the population of same-sex twin parents. And then they have two adopted samples of Swedish-born adopted kids and foreign-born adopted kids. With the Swedish sample, they can actually control for the biological parent's education level, okay? And then with the IV sample, they also use a restricted sample of kids of parents who only had 9 years of schooling. And the reason they do that is they want to get rid of spillovers where the schooling reform could have caused dynamic increases in education as well as just it moving you up 1 year. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of the results they find and then talk through the thinking. So first, for their random sample, this is just everyone in those birth cohorts. The OLS estimate of father education, mother education, or an average of fathers and mothers is shown here. You get estimates in the, around 0.2 basically. And then the bottom is showing you the twin sample if you run OLS. You get similar estimates to what they get here. Okay, now what happens if you run the twin difference estimate? You see that the OLS estimates of, say, 0.21 to 0.25 get quite a bit lower, 0.12 to 0.06, depending on the specifications, but they're roughly around 0.1. So what started as an OLS estimate of 0.25 is now an OLS estimate of about 0.1. So if you took that as at face value, it says that intergenerational persistence in education, the twin estimator says maybe half of that is truly causal. Okay, I'm just going to skip over that. What happens if you look at the adoption sample? Now there are two samples. There's the adopted born in Sweden, where they can control for the natural-born parents' education. And then there's the foreign-born sample. If they simply run OLS, again, you get estimates that are fairly similar. You get an estimate of around 0.2 in the top line estimates. And now if you use the OLS using adopted children, these also get cut to around the 0.1 range. They vary a little bit. And in this sample of the foreign-born, they're quite a bit lower. Okay, more like a 0.03, 0.04 range. Okay, and then finally, the last approach is to use compulsory schooling reform. So here again, you just run the OLS on that sample, you get estimates of around 0.2. Now if you do the IV estimate, you get again estimates that are about half the size, about 0.1. Okay, but they still vary a little bit between the twins versus the adopted versus the compulsory schooling reform. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all of, there are a lot of subtle details. Again, I encourage you to read the paper. But here are the key points. The OLS estimates you get are generally similar across samples. They're usually around 0.2, slightly higher for moms. The twin estimates are greatly reduced. And you have this finding that the mother effects are about half as large as the father effects, which is kind of an interesting thing. One story they think about here is that, again, the twin parents, maybe the moms share a lot more in common than the dads. And so when you do a twin differencing with moms who, say, have a similar parenting style, you're going to over-difference. Essentially, you're removing part of what you want to capture in terms of the causal effect. When you look at adopted sample, you also see these reduced coefficients. You get about 0.1 for mothers and fathers, but when you use the foreign-born, they're a lot smaller, around 0.04. And the IV estimates are around 0.1 for the full sample, but they're a lot more imprecise. Okay, again, slightly higher for mothers, and you get smaller estimates when they use their more restricted sample. Okay. So again, they carefully go through each of these methods and walk through the different internal validity assumptions that I kind of quickly sketched out. And then they carefully walk through the external validity, thinking about to what extent are twins and adopted and the compulsory schooling reforms representative of what you would get for the full population. And basically, two ideas there. One, there's the distributional assumptions, and then there's the effect, whether they're a heterogeneous effect. So it might be that the people who are hit by the compulsory schooling reform, who have lower education, might have a different effect on the kids' schooling than what you would find if you imposed an additional year of schooling on parents for the larger sample. So again, encourage you to read all that. But the bottom line is that they're skeptical that any one strategy can deliver a good prediction because in the background there are all these worries you have about both internal or external validity. But if you look at a few of them in conjunction, you can see some themes emerging. Okay, and basically in Sweden, and you find similar results in other Nordic countries, 0.1 seems to be a reasonable estimate of a causal effect across these three identification strategies. So you might think, I've been talking about 0.4 and 0.6 in the US. What do we make if this were really true? Well, 0.1, seems small. On the other hand, in Sweden, what we're finding for the overall persistence parameter is something like 0.2 to 0.3. So it may be actually a pretty big chunk of what we might call the nurture component. Okay. So all of this is just kind of one example of a paper that tries to do intergenerational causal effects. I think that's going to be an emerging literature going forward. Let me stop for a minute, see if there are any questions about the Homeland paper. Okay, so basically now I'm up to my last slide, so I'm going to wrap up and talk about what future directions for intergenerational mobility research. So first off is sort of an easy point. I think, there's more to be done. I showed you 9 measures. There are more potentially interesting measures of intergenerational mobility. Much more data is coming online, many more countries. So I think there's a lot for you guys, if you're interested in doing research in this area, to contribute to. I think the Chetty work showed the importance of looking at within countries. And also in answer to, Larry, your question about cross-country, it might be more appropriate to look at variation within a country. That might be a more reasonable exercise. And looking at, within country across regions, I think is important. So I think the literature has started to try to think more about unpacking the mechanisms behind the persistence, but it's still a long way to go. And there are many things we could be thinking about: human capital investments, but also I think the nature of the institutions. So one point I wanted to make that I think sometimes gets forgotten about is when you're looking at intergenerational mobility, in some sense, it's a backwards-looking measure. You can only know what that parameter is once both the parents and the kids have completed their life course, if you wanted to be really conservative about it. So that means you're really looking backwards in time to see what the completed mobility pattern is. And that mobility pattern can be comprised of things that hit the kid when they were little, like the early life stuff we talked about, or it could be the labor markets that they end up in. So it could be that there are different things that are affecting the experience mobility at different parts of the life course. Okay, and then also I think geographic mobility is an understudied issue. So when Chetty et al. Present their paper, a natural question that always comes up is how much of these differences, say in Salt Lake City versus Charlotte, North Carolina, is due to people who are moving away from those locations to better labor markets. Okay, and so I think that's a really interesting and important issue that's yet to be really well studied. And I imagine this would be an important issue in China as well, with the industrialization and the migration patterns of the last few decades. How does that geographic mobility play into intergenerational mobility? I talked a little bit about how the literature has really been largely disconnected from social welfare, but I think there's potential for more work to be done, building on the work that I mentioned by Aubergé and Mogstad on mapping mobility measures to social welfare. I highlighted a few areas that I think is particularly fertile ground for more research that you might want to think about. So we might want to think about mobility across different domains of socioeconomic status. So I've mainly talked about income, but there's education, there's health, and the interactions of that. With a really rich data set, you might be able to see people who are highly mobile with respect to income, but maybe not so much with health, or vice versa. And there might be a richer way to characterize mobility when we start to look at that. In the US, I think a lot more work should be done on family structure, because you have this emerging pattern in the US of many kids who are growing up with several different parents, with parent figures, I should say, because you have this what's called multi-partner fertility, where you could have a mom who's had kids with different fathers, and the kids are living together, and they're experiencing maybe parenting behaviors from multiple different parents and income sources from multiple different parents. And most of the research is ignoring that. So even like in the Chetty work, you've got to observe people claim kids as a tax dependent on their tax form in a particular set of years in order to study them, but that's ignoring a lot of these other family structure issues. I think there's some potential to think about household finance issues and the role of wealth in understanding patterns of mobility, particularly when we start to think of directional mobility and downward mobility. I've been interested in this idea that maybe some of the greater downward mobility I showed you among Black families in the US is related to the wide discrepancy in wealth levels between African Americans and whites in the US. And I haven't even touched on a big issue that's emerging of genomics, where people are using these rapidly growing data sets where you've got these strands of DNA, and people are using statistical techniques to map them to measures of education, and starting to show how these SNPs, they're called, influence educational attainment, and how there are important interactions between the environment that you grow up in with your genetic information in ways that have been predicted by the new research on epigenetics. So that's all just starting and hasn't really hit the mainstream intergenerational mobility research. So I think I'm done. I'll stop there, and I don't know if it's time to I can take questions or just hang around. Yeah, Larry.
So I'd like to hear what you think we can learn from the genetic data. For several reasons. One reason it seems that one thing that puzzles me about this kind of research is that there's neuropsychologists that I talk to say that we're very far from having any theory of how what we measure is actually connected to function. Right. So how could one make causal claims about SNPs and things like that on the one hand, and then the second thing is that what would we do with such information since there's not a perturbation that we could perform?
Yeah, it's a dangerous territory to speculate on. I think the more honed in it is on precise things, the better. So the closer it is to a mechanism that we understand and can think about, there's this sort of, Goldberger example that I think, it isn't Goldberger, I'm forgetting who it was, the eyeglasses story that just because vision is genetic doesn't mean we don't, a good intervention wouldn't be eyeglass. If we could identify something like that, even if it were genetic, doesn't mean that, we couldn't have an intervention matched to it. Now, what that is, it's hard to speculate about. But I think the research on early life stuff is potentially promising because there you could, suppose we moved away from broad measures of education and income and you thought about, okay, what are very specific forms of childhood stress exposures? And we could think about SNPs that we know are affected by that, by both animal studies and by more carefully done biomedical studies where you see an exposure to particular kinds of shock. Say it's like a parental loss or and then you see the changes in cortisol activity and you could tie that to genetic predisposition. So you knew it was a predisposition and an environment and this exposure to this kind of shock would make you less likely to be able to have some types of cognitive or non-cognitive functionings at a particular age, then you could imagine there would be, possibly like interventions around that where, when there's a loss in the family, there's, maybe some type of therapy that's aware of what's going on and the predispositions. This is all off the top of my head. So I think the tighter you are in thinking about something that's really precisely defined, maybe something could happen. But I think it's sort of like the intergenerational mobility stuff is way up here, and these things are all these small factors that maybe are building up to it, and we, and maybe need to leave them kind of, living in their separate worlds, but knowing that the two are connected.